In 1992, the song Watercolor Ponies was released. Singer-songwriter Wayne Watson released this song that begins by telling the story of these watercolor ponies that were painted by little hands and displayed proudly on the refrigerator door. He goes on to talk about the battle that he and his wife were in the midst of fighting in order to turn their children's hearts to the Lord and to give them a holy reverence for the Lord. And then comes the chorus where he asks his wife, "But baby, what will we do when it comes back to me and you? They look a little less like little boys every day. Oh, the pleasure of watching the children growing is mixed with a bitter cup of knowing the watercolor ponies will one day ride away." My wife and I are kind of find ourselves, right about that point in our lives. We have one of our kids is graduated from college and living up in Michigan now. We have one who's about to get married, living in Ohio, and one who is less than 3 weeks away from officially being a high school senior. I don't know if you realize this or not, but the watercolor ponies are fixing to ride away. And that's hard. That's a hard time in life for any parent. And yet, for godly mothers, that's really the goal, is to see their kids leave their nest and to live their lives for the glory of God. And that's what we're going to see this morning as we turn to 1 Samuel chapter 1. Turn in your Bibles there, if you would. 1 Samuel chapter 1. We're going to consider this morning how God is glorified through motherhood, particularly through godly mothers. Let's begin. 1 Samuel chapter 1. This is a story that is really kind of personal for my wife and I. Most of you know our oldest son is named Samuel, and it is in large part because of this story and the things that God taught us early on in our marriage. So let's begin with verses 1 through 8. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephratite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now, this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters, but to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Then Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, "Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" In these opening verses, we learn that a godly mother desires her children from the Lord. A godly mother desires her children from the Lord. By way of introduction, we first meet a certain man whose name is Elkanah in verse 1 there. And we kind of figure that he may have been someone who was kind of important because his genealogy is listed back 4 generations. You notice that? That usually is kind of an indication of someone who's important. Let me introduce myself to you. My name is Michael, son of Albert, son of Russell, son of Earl. And that's as far back as I can go. I can only go back 3 generations. I'm not that important, but Elkanah must have been kind of important. He went back 4 generations. Either that was a sign that he was important or that his genealogy was very important to him. And that might actually be the issue, is that his genealogy was very important to him, as we see there in verse 1. In verse 2, we find that he had 2 wives. The first wife is Hannah. because she is named first, we can be certain that she was his first wife. And if you peek ahead at verse 5, you will see that he loved Hannah. In fact, it tells us specifically he loved her. That's why he gave her a double portion. And it doesn't say anything about his love for Peninnah. We can probably draw from all of this that he really did not love his second wife, Peninnah, at least not the way that a husband ought to love his wife. And you might wonder, well, why would he marry a woman that he did not love? And the answer to that question is found in the rest of verse 2, where we learn that Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Remember, in verse 1, we see the genealogy going back 4 generations. That tells us that the genealogy meant something to Elkanah. That was important to him. He was the son of his father, the son of his grandfather, the son of his great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather. That genealogy was very important to him, and he did not want that genealogy to end with his name. He didn't want Elkanah to be the end of that genealogy. He wanted to make sure that that genealogy went on beyond him, beyond his name. And so he takes the second wife because God, the Lord, had closed the womb of Hannah. He took a second wife to make sure that he could have children to carry on, to ensure that his genealogy would not end with him. And after all, it was the Old Testament times, right? And so polygamy was okay, right? Isn't that what we've always heard? You know, that there was sort of this special dispensation in the Old Testament for polygamy. It was just okay back then. Isn't it? We've kind of heard that. If you haven't heard that preached, I have. I've heard people talk about that and say, well, it just must have been okay because it was happening. It happened, to good men like Abraham. He took Hagar. And Jacob, he had 4 wives. And David, a man after God's own heart, he had multiple wives, and his son Solomon had 700 of them. It must have been okay. The fact is, it wasn't. Was it okay? Everybody go like this. I already see some of you doing this, so good for you. I see you there. Everybody just go like this. No, it wasn't okay. Because we have to go back to God's original design for marriage. And when we go back to Genesis chapter 2, we find that God said that it was not good for the man to be alone, and then he said he would make a helper fit for him, a helper who corresponds to him, a helper who is like him as an image bearer of God, but not exactly like him. And when God brought to him this helper fit for him, God said, and this is his design for marriage here. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, this is what God said, revealing his design for marriage. He says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Holding fast here means being united in an unbreakable bond. And that speaks both to permanence, the permanence of marriage. God's design for marriage is to be this unbreakable bond. It's to be permanent. It's to be for as long as you both shall live. Okay? There's that permanence there. It also speaks of exclusivity. The exclusivity of marriage. The two shall become one. Not the 3, not the 4, not the 10, not the 700 in Solomon's case. The two shall become one. This is God's design for marriage. One man, one woman. Can we see this slide up there? One man, one woman. For life, right? That's God's design for marriage, is that we would have one, there would be one man, one woman, just one, and that it would last for a lifetime. And there are many ways that in which God's design for marriage today is being trampled and forgotten. And that's a message for another time. But please understand that polygamy in the Old Testament was a clear violation of God's standard and design for marriage, and was therefore sinful and wrong. That informs us then that Elkanah was wrong to take a second wife in order to have children. That was a sinful choice that grieved God. It grieved God. And boy, did it ever grieve the wife that he loved, his legitimate wife, Hannah. Let's consider her grief. Talk about her grief. Verse 3 explains how Elkanah used to go up to Shiloh each year with his family to worship and offer sacrifices. And in verse 4, we see that when they did so, Elkanah would give portions of the sacrifice to his family. That tells us that this was not a sin sacrifice. They were going to Shiloh. That's where the tabernacle was when Israel, they traveled through the wilderness with the tent of meeting. When they came into the promised land, it kind of landed there at Shiloh for a while before it went to Jerusalem. And there at Shiloh was Eli, the priest, with his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And people would go there to make sacrifices, and a sin sacrifice would be totally burned up on the altar. So this wasn't a sin sacrifice. This is most likely a sacrifice of thanksgiving. The reason I say that is because the thanks offerings would be divided up. A portion of it would be burned up on the altar. A portion of it would be given to the priest and his family, and then a portion of it would be received by the offerer back to be consumed and eaten in celebration. And so that's what we see here is he's offering the sacrifice, but then he would, and the part that he got back for himself, he would give a portion to Peninnah and to her children. But then he gave a double portion to Hannah. Why? Well, we find out it's because he loved her. And I truly believe that he did love Hannah. He just didn't really understand how to communicate that love. And he made some really boneheaded, foolish decisions in his life that communicated anything but love for Hannah. And that's really tragic that he did that. But I'll come back to that in a little bit. But I want you to understand that his actions communicated that other things were more important to him than she was. She hadn't been able to conceive and bear any children, but Elkanah loved her just the same. It says that he loved her even though she couldn't have children. So in a sense, his love was unconditional, but in another sense, it was conditional. And I'll try to flesh that out for you in a little bit. Just understand he was lousy at showing his love. But I do believe that he loved her. Let me point out something before we go on with that thought. You've no doubt noticed that it says that the Lord closed her womb, right? We see that repeated in verse 6. Verses 5 and 6 both tell us the Lord closed her womb. I've shared this before, that when Kelly and I were first married, we desired to have children from the get-go. And if we had gotten what we wanted, if things had gone according to our plans, I'm figuring we would have a son or a daughter by now who was probably 30 years old, 31 years old, somewhere like that. If we'd gotten what we wanted. But that's not how the way things worked out for us. We wanted to have kids from the get-go, but God had another plan. And it was nearly 7 years that God had closed my wife's womb. And there were times when we didn't know if we would ever experience pregnancy in childbirth. I remember times holding my wife in my arms as she cried. I remember friendships that kind of grew distanced from us because we were all young married couples, and then they started having kids, and their lives changed in a way that our lives just weren't changing, and those friendships became more and more distant, and we kind of felt like we were on the outside looking in. We learned through those years that it is God who closes the womb, and it's God who opens the womb. Psalm 127, verse 3 says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward." Having children wasn't about our decision that we wanted to have kids right away. Having children was about trusting God for when and how He chose to give us our kids. Now, eventually, in God's timing, we did experience pregnancy and childbirth, and we welcomed Samuel into our family. A couple of years later, it happened again, and Isaac was born. About 5 years after that, God chose to add to our nest through adoption. And we adopted Phoebe and welcomed her into our family. And I'll tell you what, looking back on it all now, I wouldn't have changed a thing. We have been so blessed, but those first years of not knowing were hard. And so, if I may, I'd like to just share with you a couple of thoughts about that. And just ask you to take these things to heart this morning. Number one, be sensitive to couples who don't have kids. And please do not assume that they don't want them. Don't assume that they've made the choice not to have kids. That was certainly not the case for us for nearly 7 years. We desperately wanted kids, and God just chose not to give us kids for close to 7 years. It wasn't our decision. That wasn't what we wanted. Please don't assume that. Now, I know some couples do make that decision and that choice, and I'm not sure how I feel about that in terms of the creation mandate to be fruitful and multiply. But I know some couples make that decision. That's what they want to do. But don't assume that that's the case. There are quite often there are couples who desperately want to have children. So be sensitive about that. Number two, the other thing I want to just mention is celebrate adoption. Let's celebrate adoption. Friends, it is not a fallback plan. I think sometimes that's how we view adoption, right? If we can't have children biologically, there's always adoption, as though it's some kind of fallback plan, and it's not a fallback plan. As God closes some wombs, He also opens hearts to the needs of many children who need forever homes. And I can tell you from experience that adoption is, and I am using my words very carefully, I'm thinking this out, okay? But adoption is an awesome blessing from God. And I don't use that word awesome lightly, but I've chosen to use that word here because I believe that's accurate. It is an awesome blessing from God. So let's celebrate adoption. Well, let's get back to our story here. We see in verse 6, Peninnah, because she was able to give Elkanah children, she provoked Hannah just to irritate her. And in verse 7, we see that this went on year after year. And it got to be such an emotional burden for Hannah that she lost her appetite. She just couldn't eat. All she could do was cry. And then we come to verse 8, where Elkanah asks this series of questions. And again, I believe that Elkanah did love his wife Hannah, and I believe that in some fashion his heart was probably in the right place, but he asked 4 really boneheaded questions, the fourth one being the dumbest of the 4 questions. Okay? He asked the questions. He said, why are you sad? Why won't you eat? Why are you this way, Hannah? And you just kind of want to scratch your head and say, duh. Where have you been? Have you not been paying attention? Are you new around here, pal? I mean, your wife, the wife that you love, is being emotionally abused by the second wife that you went out and got, which, by the way, sent a message to Hannah, didn't it? When he went out and got Peninnah as a second wife to give him children, what was the message? You're not good enough. Hannah, you're not good enough. You're not meeting my needs. Now, he might not have said it. He might not have put that in words, but that's what his actions, that's what his actions said to her. That's what she heard. And then he asked his fourth question. Can you imagine the hurt? He says, am I not more to you than 10 sons? And friends, that's the last thing that Hannah wanted to hear. What she needed to hear was, Hannah, you mean more to me than 10 sons. Now, I do believe that he loved Hannah, but I also believe that he was a fool who had no idea how to prove his love for his wife. And I also think that there are a lot of husbands today who fall into that same category. They love their wives, they just don't necessarily know how to demonstrate that or communicate that. Husbands, today we need to do a better job at loving our wives than Elkanah did at loving Hannah. She needed to hear, it's just you and me for life. That's the message that she needed to hear. It's not the message that she heard. The message she heard was, you're not good enough. You're not providing what I need. My genealogy is more important to me than you. I need to have children more than I need to be faithful to just you. And so I'm going to go out and get a second wife. That's the message that she heard. What she needed to hear was, it's just you and me, one man, one woman for life. That's not the message that she heard from her husband. Husbands, does your wife know that you are head over heels in love with her? Is she secure in knowing that you are enthralled with her and that it's just her and you for life? I want to introduce something this morning. It's what I'm calling Mighty Men of Marriage. I don't know where I came up with that name, just kind of came to me this week. I've been doing a lot of reading in Second Samuel, about David and his mighty men. And I think maybe that's kind of, these are mighty men of value or mighty men of war. I want to introduce to you what I'm thinking of as mighty men of marriage. And I'm calling on every husband here to be a mighty man of marriage. And this comes with two things. It comes with a homework assignment for this week, and then it comes for really a year-long project. And I want all of us men, or all of us husbands, to embrace this and to accept this call to be a mighty man of marriage. First, let's talk about your homework assignment for this week. If there is anything, listen to me, men, if there is anything other than your walk with Christ that is more important to you than your wife, I want you to make it your goal to get your priorities straight. Talking about priorities here with number one. Get your priorities straight. God first, and then your wife. And ladies, you're saying, how come I'm second? Well, trust me, you want your husband to love the Lord his God with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength. Because if he does that, he will love you as Christ loved the church. That has to be the priority. And husbands, you need to make sure that you've got those priorities straight. If there's something, if you find that your job is more important than God or more important than your wife, or if you find that your hobbies, your pastimes are more important, or you find that that anything, your pastimes, any of those things, if you find that there's something that's more important to you than God and more important to you than your wife, you need to get your priorities straight this week. And I would also just add this, that if there is sin in your life, please understand, sin always has a negative impact on your life. And there are sins that are going to have a negative impact on your marriage. And I want you to search your heart and your life this week and just see, is there something in my life, a sin in my life right now that is damaging my marriage in any way? You know, there's some that are obvious. I mean, if it's pornography, obviously that's going to be an issue that's going to be damaging, have a damaging impact on your marriage. You need to repent. You need to get right with God and confess that and seek with his help and his strength to root that sin out of your life. But there are others, the sin of pride, for instance. Why is it sometimes hard to say, I was wrong and I'm sorry? Sometimes that's important in marriage, isn't it? Any perfect husbands here? Okay. I didn't think so. Sometimes it's important to say, I was wrong and I'm sorry. What keeps us from doing that? Pride. If you find that the sin of pride is present in your heart and life, confess it, repent, get right with God. The sin of selfishness. I want it my way. I'm not willing to consider your interests or your desires. I'm not willing to consider you more important or more significant than myself. I want it my way. I want my things. I want my priorities. If you find that the sin of selfishness is having that negative impact on your marriage, then repent and get right with God and root those things out. That's your assignment for this week, men, husbands. Search your heart. Make sure your priorities are right, that you're repenting of sin, and so you can prepare yourself for step number 2. The second thing I want you to do is make it a priority this week and every week between now and next Mother's Day. 52 weeks, all right? I'm talking a whole year here. I want us as husbands to do at least one thing each and every week that clearly communicates your love for your wife and shows her how much you value her place in your life. There's a lot of ways to do that. It could be through the spoken word, the written word. You write your wife a card. You can get her maybe a bouquet of flowers, or just spend some quality time with her. Take her out for dinner out, or just, sacrifice an evening of TV to sit out on the lanai and just talk and communicate and reconnect. But I want you to do something. And what I really want us to do is hold one another accountable in these things, man. I want us to work together as a church, as a body of believers, of husbands here in Daniels Road Baptist Church. I want us to work together on this, so that we can kind of hold one another accountable. If you come up with a great idea, if you find out that some flower shop has a sale on roses, send me a text, just let me know. So I can do that too, and maybe I can tell others, hey, go down to the flower shop and get some flowers for your wife, or we kind of share those ideas with one another. And here's, I'm thinking this is a big plan. I don't know if this will come about, but wouldn't it be cool if we could kind of collaborate together in about a year from now, and we write a book called Mighty Men of Marriage, all right, written by the men of Daniels Road Baptist Church, and we share that with other Christian men and other churches so that they can be mighty men of marriage. We need to do a better job, friends, of loving our wives. We certainly need to do a better job of loving our wives than Elkanah did at loving Hannah. Let's encourage one another in this. We don't want to be that kind of husband. We want to be the kind of husband God wants us to be, the kind of husband that Elkanah failed to be. So we see Hannah's grief. Now let's notice her prayer. Her prayer. Look at verses 9 and 10. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. If the Lord had closed her womb, it only made sense for her to pray to him and ask him to open her womb. In verse 9, we see that Eli the priest is sitting, it says, beside the temple. Now, there was no permanent structure, no temple built there in Shiloh. That was where the tent of meeting is. So it just means that he was there by the tent of meeting. He was seated there. That means he was taking his place as the authority there as the priest. And so as he's sitting there, Hannah comes along, seems to not notice Eli being there, but she came there to pray, just standing outside of the tent of meeting, and she's there, and she's praying through her tears, and asking God for a son. As we're about to see, she not only prayed for a son, she also vowed to give that son right back to him. Look at verses 11 through 28. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. And she continued praying before the Lord. Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart. Only her lips moved and her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, No, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman. For all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord, and they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her, and in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. The man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, As soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up to her along with the 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. And she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, and the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, "O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who is standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore, I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. Here in this passage that we just read, we learn that a godly mother dedicates her children to the Lord. In verse 11, we see that the content of her prayer, which is really her vow. And her vow was simply put to give the son that she was asking for right back to God all the days of her life. And you notice the promise that no razor would touch his head. That would indicate that this was the Nazirite vow. You can read about that in Numbers chapter 6 if you want to go home and study that later. But that Nazirite vow was basically a vow to say that this person would be set apart unto the Lord. And Hannah here is setting apart, or is vowing to set apart this son that she's asking for, set him apart to the Lord all the days of his life. In verses 12 through 16, we read about an exchange between Hannah and the priest that was really kind of born out of a misunderstanding. She's praying. She's has this vexation in her heart, it says, and she's praying, so her lips are moving, but there's no sound of her voice. And Eli just took it to mean that she was drunk. And there's a lesson there. We shouldn't jump to conclusions, but I do want you to understand that was probably more of a logical conclusion for Eli to draw than you might understand. This story takes place during the time of the Judges. All right, if you're familiar with the book of Judges, you know that it ends with the verse that says, "And there was no king in Israel, and everyone did as seemed right in his own eyes." Now, you can imagine when sinful people do what seems right in their own eyes, there's a lot of sinful kinds of things that are going on. And that was the day in which they lived. I also want you to understand that Eli saw sinfulness and wickedness every single day. Remember earlier we read that at Shiloh there was Eli and his sons Phinehas and Hophni. Okay, not Phineas and Ferb, but Phinehas and Hophni was there, and that's all it says there in verse 2 or 3. That's all we know is it's them. But as we get into the next chapter, we'll find out. In fact, peek ahead at chapter 2, verse 12. Chapter 2, verse 12, we read that these two ne'er-do-wells are called worthless men. That's harsh, isn't it? Worthless men. Did you notice in verse 16 what Hannah said? She said, "Please do not regard your servant as a" what? As a worthless woman. So this idea of drunkenness and worthlessness kind of go hand in hand here. And I think in chapter 2, verse 12, when we read that they were worthless men, now you understand that in all of chapter, if you read all of chapter 2, you'll find out that these guys were cheats. They were defrauding people. They were stealing from people. They were also sexual predators. There were the women that were ministering there at the temple, and they were acting immorally and going to bed with some of these women. And they were sexual predators. But there was a lot of wickedness in these two sons, and they would pay the price for that in time. But the fact that it says that they're worthless, and that Hannah says, "Don't think of me as worthless," when she's being accused of being drunk, would inform me that Hophni and Phinehas were probably drunkards as well, and it would certainly fit the mold of the way they're described there in chapter 2. And so Eli sees this all the time, and it wasn't a huge leap for him to assume that Hannah was in fact herself drunk. But he quickly realizes that he'd arrived at an erroneous conclusion when she answers him. And so he, understanding that she's not drunk, then he gives her a blessing. He basically tells her that he's asking God to grant her request. And I want you to understand that Eli was not making any promises to Hannah here. He was a priest, not a prophet. All right, he wasn't making any promises to her. He was just simply blessing her and saying, may the Lord answer your request. But that seemed to be enough encouragement for her. She was able to go away knowing that God had heard her prayers, and so she's able to go away back to her family. She can eat now with her family. Her face is no longer saddened by the emotional wounds caused by the family, by particularly Peninnah and Elkanah. Now she's able to focus on the hope that she has and that God has heard her prayers. And so in verse 19, after returning home, we read that Elkanah and Hannah enjoyed marital intimacy with one another and that God remembered her, meaning that he answered her prayer. Verse 20, in due time. That means in God's time. It means in the perfect time. I shared with you earlier that we went for nearly 7 years without children at the beginning of our marriage, and that's not what we wanted. We wanted to begin having children very quickly after marriage, but that's not what God wanted. And as I look back on it now, I can see all the wisdom of God that I couldn't see at that time. At that time, all I could see is this is what I want, and it's not what God's giving us, and there was hurt there. But looking back on it now, we got married when I was only halfway through my undergraduate studies. If we had children right away, I'm not sure I would have ever gotten my bachelor's degree, let alone go on to seminary and complete my graduate studies. It was about a year or so after I had taken my first church and began to get my feet grounded in ministry that finally God said, okay, now it's time. And I can look back on that now and see the wisdom in that. And I can see that this is God's perfect time, in due time. In God's perfect timing, he granted Hannah her request, and she conceived and bore a son. And that brings us now to her obedience and reverence. Her obedience and reverence. Her obedience and reverence began with the name that she chose for her son. The name Samuel means the name of God. And she gave him that name because it was to God that she appealed for this son. And she knew that it was from God that she had received him. Once again, Psalm 127, verse 3, I read it earlier. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Hannah knew that this bundle of joy in her arms was from God, and she acknowledged that in the name that she chose for her son. Her obedience and reverence continued once she had weaned her son. As we see in verses 21 through 23, she didn't go to the yearly sacrifice in order to wean Samuel before giving him back to God. Now, in our culture, as best I understand anyway, weaning basically just means, kind of an end to nursing or breastfeeding or bottle feeding and beginning like the baby food and the cereal and so on. We kind of consider that weaning, at least I think. But in that culture, in the ancient cultures, weaning was much more than just a cessation of nursing the child. It was really getting that child to the point where you don't have to puree the food anymore, where they can begin to feed themselves and they can eat just about anything. And most commentators say that the weaning process probably was 3 to 4 years old, or 3 to 4 years long in that process. So it was probably about the time that Samuel was, kind of late in the toddler years, maybe even just beyond the toddler years, when she made her way back to Shiloh with a 3-year-old bull, a measure of flour, and a skin of wine for a sacrifice. And notice at the end of verse 24, it says, and the child was young. We don't know the exact age, but again, most commentators would, based on the fact of weaning in the ancient cultures, figure he's probably 3 to 4 years old. So here he is, he's young. I want you to just think about that for a moment. Mothers, you can probably identify with this even more so than I can, but 3 to 4 years old for a little boy. I mean, that's the point where he's talking. He's able to look up at his mother and look into her eyes and tell her he loves her. You know, he hasn't yet gotten beyond that snuggle stage, right? When does that happen with boys? When do they get beyond where they don't want to snuggle anymore? I don't know what age that is, but he's still right there. He's still into that snuggling. You know, can you imagine having this little boy who can look at you and say he loves you and wants to snuggle up with you and needs his mom and loves his mom? That's where they're at right now. Okay, you kind of get a feel for what's happening as she takes this child to Shiloh. And after offering the sacrifice in verse 25, Hannah explains to Eli the vow that she had made and how she was now here to fulfill that vow. She says to lend her young son to the Lord. And by lend here, what she means is to give him to God for all the days of his life. And that's what every godly mother does. That's the goal for every mother who is obedient to God and who reverences him. But it's usually a little later in life when most mothers have to give their kids to God in that way. I mean, you know, where they actually leave them and their kids leave and there's that separation. I'll never forget when we moved to Asia. We were at the airport. It was really, really early on. It was actually a Sunday morning that we left. And we were at the airport in Grand Rapids. We were going to fly from Grand Rapids to Chicago and then from Chicago on into Beijing. But we were there at the airport, and that's where everyone gathered. You know, and there were lots of people. Lots of family was there. People from our church was there. David's second cousin and his wife, they were there. But we had all these people there. But I'll never forget my mom and Kelly's mom and the tears that they shed as, you know, they were saying goodbye and lending us to the Lord. And we were old. Well, I was old. Kelly was not old back then. No, let me say it again. She's not old now. I'm getting myself into a lot of trouble here, and I'm just going to move on before I dig this hole any deeper. Okay, but you understand what I'm saying. I mean, we weren't 3 or 4 years old. Okay. Here we are, adults with our own children, and our moms are crying their eyes out as they're saying goodbye to us at the airport, as they lent us to the Lord. Can you imagine the emotions for Hannah as she lent her young son to the Lord and walked away that day? But she did it. And she did it because that's what every godly mother wants. For her children to be set apart for God, to serve the Lord, and to bring him glory. And in chapter 2, we read of Hannah's song of praise. And that's really a remarkable thing. When you understand everything that she just did, here she's wanted this child for years. She had to endure the hurt of watching her husband go take a second wife in order to give him children. Can you imagine when finally she learns that she's pregnant and she gives birth to the son and she goes through all the process of weaning him. She snuggles him and he snuggles her and looks up at her and says, "Mommy, I love you." All of that, and then she goes to Shiloh and she lends him to the Lord. She gives him to God all the days of his life. And then she composes a song of praise. I'm not going to take the time to read that. That's in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10 there. You'll find that song of praise, very similar to Mary's song of praise in Luke chapter 1 as well. But if you read that, I would urge you to read through that later on this afternoon. Most of chapter 2, though, we got the first 10 verses as Hannah's song of praise, but most of chapter 2 tells us all about Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. We learn about how they were cheating people, how they were sexual predators, and just all of their wickedness. But then, right in the middle of the chapter, verses 18 through 20, we find a stark contrast to the two sons of Eli. Look at chapter 2, verses 18 through 20, where it says, Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. And his mother used to make for him a little robe and take it to him each year when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, May the Lord give you children by this woman for the petition she asked of the Lord. So then they would return to their home. And if you look at verse 21, you'll find that God did, in fact, answer that prayer, and she had more children. But in these verses I just read, these verses show us that a godly mother disciples her children for the Lord. A godly mother disciples her children for the Lord. We see her discipleship of Samuel in her example. She came every year to worship God. You think that example made an impression on her son? I do. I still remember to this day the example of service that my mom set for me as she led our VBS at our church on multiple years. She started bus ministries at two different churches, one in Charlotte, Michigan, and when we moved to Jackson, Michigan, she started a bus ministry at a church there in Jackson as well. She taught Sunday school for years. She served as a sponsor for the church youth group. And our kids have been blessed to see an example of godliness and dedication to the Lord in their mother. Whether in Asia, where she was leading Bible studies with the use of an interpreter, or teaching at English Corners and helping out house churches with that, or here in Fort Myers, whether she's teaching ESL, or teaching her Sunday school class, or mopping floors and taking out the garbage. By the way, I hope you understand, this church has been blessed with a great pastor's wife. All right? I want to give a shout out to that, because I bring that up for this reason. Last week, we heard a story at a conference we were at. We heard a story of a pastor who, in a church business meeting, with the pastor's wife sitting there, someone spoke up and said, the pastor's wife doesn't do enough around here. And I can't imagine anyone ever saying that. Don't ever say that, please. But for sure, there's no call for that here. Your pastor, you hit the jackpot with a pastor's wife. You got the short straw with a pastor, but you hit the jackpot with the pastor's wife. And I just want to give a shout out to her. But our kids have seen that. They've seen that godly example in their mother, and I'm thankful for that. And I believe that Samuel, not our son Samuel, but the Samuel we're reading about here, I believe he saw that example in his mother as well. We also see Hannah's discipleship in her love. Every year, Hannah brought him a new little robe. Hannah discipled her son through her example and through her love. I just want to share with you, I was blessed to have a mother who discipled me through her witness for Jesus Christ. I was pretty young on that Sunday night in Charlotte, Michigan. I was just a very young child. We were having our evening service at church, and I, like a typical little kid, I was probably drawing pictures on the bulletin or just looking around at other people. I don't really remember what Pastor McDaniel was preaching that night. But I do remember this. I remember it distinctly. He talked about a crown of thorns. And I didn't know what a crown of thorns was. I don't think I'd ever heard that term before, or at least if I had, it hadn't sunk in. I didn't know what that was, but I didn't like the sounds of it. And it just kind of stuck with me, no pun intended, but it stuck with me that night. And as church service came to an end, and we went out and got in the car and we drove home. When we got home, we walked into the house. I asked my mom, what is a crown of thorns? And my mom saw an opportunity, and she sat down with me. I'll never forget this. We sat at the dining room table at our house in Charlotte, Michigan, and she explained to me what a crown of thorns was. And she explained why Jesus wore it and how it punctured his skin and dug into his flesh and caused him to bleed, and how it was painful and awful. And she explained to me that he wore that crown of thorns because of his love for me. She explained that he was beaten and scourged and nailed to a cross. She explained to me that he died on that cross in order to pay for my sin. Now, I didn't understand everything at that point the way that I understand things today. I understand today that Jesus is God's eternal Son. And as God, his life was perfect, or is perfect, still is. And that he offered that perfection as payment for my sinfulness when he died on the cross. You know why? Because he loves me, because my sin separates me from God and would continue to do so for all eternity unless that sin was paid for. My mom explained to me that Jesus died in order to pay for my sin, and that that he rose again from the dead, and that if I would believe in him, if I would put my faith in him, that I would be saved from my sin, that I would not be separated from God anymore, that I would have eternal life with him forever. And that night, in our home in Charlotte, Michigan, with my mom at my side, my dad was there as well. I remember I prayed and I confessed my faith in Jesus, and I asked him to forgive me and to save me. And you know what? On that night, November 4th, 1973, you know why I know the date? Because my mom wrote it down in her Bible. Showed me years later. I didn't know the date for years. She showed me years later. But November 4th, 1973, Jesus saved me because I put my faith and trust in him. And friend, I want to invite you, if you have never put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, I want you to understand you're a sinner and your sin separates you from God, and there's nothing you can do to change that. There's not one thing you could ever do to change that. And if you were to die in your sin, you'd be separated from God forever and ever in a place the Bible describes as a lake of fire. But there's good news, friends. God loves you. Jesus died to pay for your sin. He offered his perfection and payment for your sinfulness. He rose again. He lives today. And he's offering to you this free gift of forgiveness and salvation. All you need to do is turn from your sin and turn to the Savior. Put your faith and trust in him today. Just confess to him, Lord Jesus, I believe in you. I believe that you paid for my sin when you died on the cross. I believe that you live today. Lord, I am turning from my sin and I'm turning to you right now. And I'm trusting in you to save me. And listen, friends, if you come to that moment in your life today, would you please let me know before you leave here? If you're watching on our live stream, please leave a message right now. Just let us know today is the day I'm putting my faith and trust in Jesus Christ. I am a follower of Jesus Christ today, in large part because my mother desired me from the Lord. And she dedicated me to the Lord. And she discipled me for the Lord. And I'm thankful for that. I'm going to tell her that later this afternoon. What will you do to honor your mother today? Men, husbands, what will you do to honor the mother of your children today? To all of you godly mothers here this morning, to those of you who are also watching online, let me just say to you, thank you and God bless.